G'day and welcome back. Always need the lyrebird for a more interesting video. So this is the second video in my series on learning from other people's mistakes. And if you remember from the last video, what I did is I used the endgame table base to analyze a whole bunch of master games and look at particular endgames where a very strong player makes a mistake in the endgame. Now, the premise here was that when a very strong player makes a mistake, it's a really instructive mistake, and we can learn a lot from what happened in the game, what led up to it, and why they made the mistake. So today I have a really interesting game, which it's from the 2020 Norway Chess, Firouzja versus Carlsen. This is very well covered by a video by Daniel King on I'll Play Chess. So if you want to see the full game, go there by all means. I'm just going to focus on the end game where Firouzja made a one move blunder. And this is really particularly interesting because it's sort of joining all the dots of these different videos that we're making. First of all, I'm able to sort of use my end game analysis to find games where a master made a mistake. And then this is a mistake involving corresponding squares. So it sort of links up with the other end game series videos which I have been doing. So it is a really fascinating mistake. So let us go and have a look. So I will just switch across to the capture screen. Here we go. Now this is the position after move 59. It's a drawn position. You can see I might just leave the engine running just to see what's going on. Obviously, the engine thinks this is a draw, and this is where we get the transition to a pawn endgame. Now you'll notice we've seen this structure a lot already in the corresponding squares analysis. So we'll look at that in a little bit. The final sort of bit of the analysis will be looking at the corresponding squares. But you can see that it's this sort of backwards pawn situation, triangle shape backwards pawn, where you can see black would have to be advanced with his king to push the pawn. Otherwise, if you think of pushing the pawn, taking the pawn with the white king in front here somewhere, then that's most likely going to be a draw. So basically, black's king has to be able to advance. Now, what we'll see here is a drawn position. So what that really means is that white can hold black out because he has corresponding squares. And you see the engine there. In this position, there's only one drawing move, which makes a lot of sense. You take the opposition, take corresponding square. So just look at the engine as we stick through. So Carlsen playing black moves back, and you can see there's actually, we'll see this a bit more. There's two squares which Firouzja would go to. He goes to one of them. So Carlsen now moves across to the queen side, try and break through there. So king f8 and king to f2. So basically, as one king runs to the queen side, Firouzja has to do the same with his king. You can see that there's a bit of sneakiness there by Carlsen, but it's all drawn. So now king d2, king d3, both corresponding squares. So Firouzja picks one of those. Carlsen advances to king d6, and you can see now this is corresponding squares. The engine telling us king d2 is the only drawing move. Right, and you can see the logic there is basically you could view it as distant opposition. You could also view it as the fact that corresponding squares here, we'll look at them later, is that when black moves king to c5, white has to answer that with king to c3. That is the corresponding squares. So the square that he is supposed to do that from is move back to king d2 square, keep himself flexible. What Firouzja did. If you look at the video by Daniel King, you'll see that I think Firouzja had 3 seconds left or something, right? So you can understand why people make these sort of mistakes when they're on time pressure. And then now Carlsen moved king c5, and now black is the opposition, and white gets outflanked. Black will be able to move on to one of these key squares. We'll call that critical squares, and if black gets one of those critical squares, then he will be able to take the white pawn, and if he can take the white pawn, then obviously 2 pawns advance and win. So that was the mistake which Firouzja made. Just that simple. That's on the thumbnail. In this position here, he made a mistake involving corresponding squares. So what I'm going to do now is going to go right back to the starting position. And one sort of extra way of doing this is I'm going to use my simulation tool to just sort of get a bit more of a feel for this position. I think it really provides a lot of insights. So just give me 1 second while I load that up. Okay, here's my simulator set up. If you remember how we do it, there's 3 boxes up top. So this is if black is to move and it's a draw, where does the white king have to be? So they're basically a corresponding square analysis. So you can see if that black king is on h5, and then the white king has to be on h3. That's the corresponding square for that. And then if you think of the sort of normal sort of path process going across the queen side, if we moved to g6, then you can see that the white king has to be on g2 or g4. All makes sense, just sort of corresponding squares. Now you can see, so there's an in-between square here, h6. What happens on h6? Well, in that case, the logical square to think of is actually h2, but h4 works as well, right? So that's the sort of corresponding squares go across. So that if you're on the g file, then the white king also has to be g file. And you've moved the F file as you're moving across like Carlsen did. If you're on F7 or F8, then by and large, the white king has to be on F1, F2, or F3. So there's no space constraints, which you've seen in a lot of the Grigoriev problems, where one side doesn't have the space to maneuver. In this case, white has plenty of space, black has plenty of space, and we'll have matching space. You'll notice also that white would also draw in this position if he was on G6, because then he would gobble up the 2 pawns, but then black would move to E7, and that would draw. In fact, there are some cases where white would actually win in the sort of counterattack type situation. Got to always bear that in mind with corresponding squares. Okay, so F file, go to E file. If you look at where the, by and large, if the black king is between E6 and E8, most likely the white king has to just be on the E file so that he can either duck back to the king side or can continue to move across the queen side. We go to D file, same thing. You can see there's a bit of variation, but basically the best 2 squares are D2 and D3. That covers black is on D6 or D7 or D8. D1 would no longer qualify because white needs to be able to cover king to C5 with king to C3. And then now we go across to these squares here, and you can see this is where the white has to be on guard. Absolutely right. If, well, black can't go there, but if C5 or A5, then white has to be blocking on C3 or B3, or even even A3 and A5. So that's corresponding to it. And this sort of tells you that white should be able to hold it, but when Carlsen played that slightly tricky king D6 and Firouzja played king C3, he should have just played king D2, and he'd still be on a corresponding square. So I thought that sort of provides a little bit of insight about, let's say you've got a block here on the 3rd rank, and then as you go back, you've got to cover across by running across from one entry point to the other entry point, and then once again you have to block. It's easiest to block on the 4th rank. Yeah. So I hope that sort of provides a little bit more intuition to what we're now going to go on to, which is the sort of traditional corresponding squares analysis of this position. Okay, here we are back in this position. Now, one more move. Look. Right, so I've pre-annotated the corresponding squares. Now, what you should probably do first is have a look at this position and analyze it yourself. But we've seen this position quite a few times before, as I said, the sort of the backwards triangle pawn formation. Now, I forgot to mark them up, but we need to mark up the key squares. Basically, they're the key squares for a blocked pawn. You need to get to any of those squares in line with it, 3 squares on either side, and if you are able to do that, as black king in this case, if you're able to do that, then you'll be able to shoulder around and capture the white pawn, and once you capture the white pawn, you'll win easily. Now, so as a result, when Carlsen took the bishop on h5, there's only one corresponding square. White has to block the black king moving on to either of those key squares. There is only one square which does that, which is what Firouzja did. If we move on, so now Carlsen tracks back to h6. It's a little bit tricky here because he's actually threatening to go to these 2 squares as well, and the corresponding square to that is a couple of choices here, but h4 makes the most choice. So once again, we're actually on one of the key squares now, but we're definitely blocking black's king out, and black's not going to be able to make any more progress now on this side of the board, because if he moves sideways well. So let's continue. We've already, I'll mark these squares out later on. So now black has started the progression to the green side. Now what might be worth doing, I'll just show very briefly. You think of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moves to get to queen side. If we look at it from the white perspective as well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So It's the same number of moves, therefore there'll be a one-to-one correspondence to the files which black and white have to be on. Just give me 1 second. I seem to have made my arrows a little bit short. Okay, that's good enough. Therefore, white has to move on to the corresponding square G3. Okay, now Carlsen moved to F8, and now I'm highlighting the fact that white has a fair bit of choice. He needs to keep moving across because the squares, the path is the same length. Choose either one, which Firouzja does. Carlsen moves to the E7 square, and white's corresponding squares are E2 and E3. Carlsen is a little bit tricky there. So at this stage, Firouzja does the right thing. So that's still the corresponding squares on the E file, moves across the D file. So you can see that Carlsen's moved to D7, and white has a choice of D2 or D3. And now Carlsen moves to D6 because there's the threat of moving to C5 square. White has to be able to match that and go to the C3 square. So he could actually be on D2 or D3. He's on D3, so he should move to D2, but he didn't. And that's where everything goes horribly wrong, because now black moves there. Okay, so this is the final sort of mapping, which I'd like to sort of leave you with. You can see that corresponding squares are H5, H3, and then H6 and H4, and so on. And what happened was that because white, in this case Firouzja, moved on to the C3 square, and he should have been waiting to only move on the C3 square when Carlsen moved on the C5 square, and then he just resigned when he realized what he did wrong. Can't blame him, 3 seconds on the clock. So, but I thought it was a very, very sort of good example of corresponding squares, a real world example, and I kind of like it, when Animal Smith would have said, I like it when a plan comes together, because I've been able to use my endgame analyzer for looking for blunders by top players, and then I've been able to use my little sort of simulator to sort of demonstrate in a simple way, where the corresponding squares are, and then I've obviously built this overlay into Skid vs PC to sort of highlight corresponding squares. So I might just do one more thing before I wrap up. Okay, so here is the Venn diagram version of corresponding squares, just to show how white's able to match everything, right? I've matched out the key squares there: A4, B4, C4, F4, B4, H4, and then just the normal process. Black's on H5, white needed on H3, and so on, just exactly from the chess analysis board. And then you've mapped the squares 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8, 9, 7, 8, 9, matching the same squares. White has time to get across, and of course there are extra corresponding squares in this case, like the D2, E2, F2, G2 squares, and so on. Actually, quite important. What it means is white always has the extra spare square to deal with, right? Whereas if you just squeeze back on his rank, wouldn't be able to do that. And you can see on the sort of Venn diagram version of it that white has matching moves to match anything which black is trying to do. Final thing I wanted to say today. I mean, eagle-eyed. This Venn diagram was designed for white having the advantage. So I'm not quite too sure it's worked exactly as it should have, but not to worry. Look, I hope you've enjoyed looking at that. It's a very interesting sort of study of that position, Firouzja Carlsen, where a really top player in time travel made a blunder, and we could go through the analysis and show what he did wrong from a corresponding squares perspective. Hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching.